Now you've learned something about the Jewish world and about the Roman world with respect to eating and dining. Now I'd like you to go back to that text, the conflict of Antioch, Galatians 2:11-14. And as you're considering it, what do you see now that you didn't see before? One thing I'd like to encourage you to think about is that most people reading this text assume that the eating event that Paul is talking about in recounting this was at worship together. As many of you know, public worship, Christian worship, began with a meal. The Lord's Supper wasn't just a ritual meal, it was a real full meal. We see that in the book of Acts. So most people assume that's what he's talking about, and that it's about the public assembly. And it's certainly possible. But there's a few scholars, most notably a scholar by the name of Magnus Setterholm, who looks at this passage and says, why are we restricting it only to Sunday morning? It doesn't mention anything about Sunday morning, it just talks about eating together. Well, what if they understood the worship event the way Jewish people understood worship events? That eating was what Luther called Gottesdienst, which is divine service, how God serves us and how we serve God. And what if that's every time we're eating? So failing to eat together creates a social difference in every circumstance, not just Sunday morning. Does that change how we read this, especially going back to what we know about eating in Rome and in Judaism? How does that change what you see here? I encourage you to look carefully at these few verses, and maybe go ahead and read the rest of what Paul says to the end of chapter 2. Does that explain a little of why Paul immediately goes from this to start talking about salvation in its fullest sense, and about Jews and Gentiles? Because one thing leads to another for Paul. So I'd like you to try to consider what's going on here. How does understanding the context change our reading? I hope that this has been a productive study and that you continue with positive discussion.